So I only hope I live up to something. So yes, but thank you so much to the Addiction Network for inviting me, and to Derek for all of your work in kind of organizing this. I am particularly excited to be here because I have enjoyed the recent presentations by Bruce, by Hanna Pickard, by the group that did the talk on the brain disease model of addiction and reassessing that. And so I'm just keenly aware of being a humanist who's coming to this conversation that involves scientists, practitioners, social scientists. And so this is, I think, one of the things that I have come to realize is just how valuable the kind of interdisciplinary conversations can be. And I hope that I might be bringing something of kind of history and literature on addiction to the table, and that it might be helpful in some way. All right, so for today's talk, I am going to talk my way into my key points or findings by way of a little perambulation. And I'm doing this because I sense that my own contributions resonate very strongly with the work of this group in challenging the brain disease model of addiction. But my findings, both in a book project and then also in a recent edited collection, have been far from straightforward. And so I feel like if I just start with the end, it loses some of the surprise, and at least the surprise that I felt. And so the thing that I want to kind of get across in moving into it through my sort of initial failures is just to suggest I wasn't particularly looking for what I found, but it was there. And I think the fact that it was there and it sort of the evidence had to convince me in a way makes my findings a little bit more, not just surprising, but I suppose I might just say believable, at least to me. This wasn't an argument-driven exploration, I'll just say that. And then I'll also say that as a kind of final part of my opening preface, that I do think this, I hope that this presentation does feed into those webinars I mentioned by Bruce and Hanna, and on that BDMA book, because each of those presentations was really pretty vigorously reassessing that brain disease model. And that's something that I do from a kind of different angle. I also want to say that I'm going to be doing that by taking us back into a history of addiction. That is a story that has been told kind of increasingly by myself, but other scholars like Phil Withington, Carl Eric Fisher, who I think is going to be giving a presentation to this network, Josie Cree, Tim Hickman, and others. So there's a group of folks who are kind of telling a story of the prehistory of addiction or the history of addiction, Roy Porter, Jessica Warner. But in spite of that historical work that's been done, as all of you know and have pointed out, there's a kind of triumphalist narrative around the presentation of BDMA, as if it represents this lightning flash of scientific insight against the heavy moralism of earlier centuries. And that's relevant for me because I work in that earlier century. I work in the 16th and 17th century largely. And at least as I began to read current addiction theories based in the brain disease model, there was a sense that in the past there was religion and prejudice. In the present, there's the fMRI machine and understanding. There was superstition, and then there was discovery and insight. So that condemnation of pre-modern views of addiction, to the extent that there's any recognition that there was thinking about it at all, seemed to be moralizing and insisting on sin and the 7 deadly sins. And in the case of the brain disease model, there was a move away from sin and moralizing, but also a move away from community, from intimacy into, even from an individual body, kind of into a portion of the brain. So that's something that I then kind of wrestle with and challenge in my own work. And that itself, and I think many of you might, this may possibly resonate for you. It's been a kind of journey in that I work at an institution that has a number of people who themselves do addiction research, but at times people who work in kind of wet science in labs with brains, it's harder to get any traction for that conversation. I find myself sort of very much butting up. That's not the case if I'm working with somebody in the social work school or other places, but specifically that kind of wet lab context has been a hard one to engage in dialogue. So that means I'm all the more grateful to be here. So this is a kind of a fair-sized introduction to just say thank you for having me here. All right, so today's talk, I'm going to begin, as I suggest, with a part one that talks about my assumptions and some of the dead ends that really started my research. Then I'm going to shift to part two, which is going to talk about the surprises. They may not be surprising to you, but my findings were quite surprising to me. I hope you're going to find that they're productive contributions to you all. And then I'm going to end with a kind of shorter part three, which is just questions. All right, so part one, assumptions. My involvement in addiction studies and theory started about 10 years ago, and it was quite unexpected. So I'm a literary historian, a literature professor, and my work had generally fallen under the big tent of law, political philosophy, and religion. So I had written a book on treason, and as I was completing it, I had looked through all of these different depositions and files and interrogations on treasonous activity, some of it around the gunpowder plot of 1605, which was that plot to blow up the Parliament building in England. And one of the rebels had been described as addicted to treason. And so my feelers went off, and I was just curious why that word was there. Was there a behavioral addiction to something like treason that hadn't been recognized? So from there, I began to research a book on the varieties of addiction. To behaviors, but most of all to drugs, to alcohol, to newly introduced tobacco, to laudanum, and eventually opium. I then thought maybe building on the work of Roy Porter and others, I might talk about chocolate and coffee, heading into the 17th and 18th centuries. So I felt like I had this clear path, which was to chronicle this range of addictions, which had not been done. And I was going to be chronicling a range of these substances and behaviors well before people had posited the kind of discovery of addiction, which had been dated to 1800 by Benjamin Rush and Thomas Trotter. So I thought, well, I'll be contributing to addiction studies by kind of moving the date back. And I also thought I'm contributing to a really wonderful, robust conversation on substances by colleagues who work on the tavern or who work on gin or who work on intoxication, as Phil Withington does. So I thought, perfect, this is going to really maybe contribute. So now I'm going to share a couple of slides just to give you a little bit of a sense of, and so this is going to be a second. Derek and I have checked this out several times, and it just takes a minute for it to upload. Okay, here we go. Okay, here we go. Thank you for your patience as this uploads. So I don't know quite why. I'm sure there's a way of perfectly managing this, but I have not done it yet. So what I'm going to be showing you when it uploads is just slides that were some of my early findings, including then that very first quote from, can you see this now? And Derek, is it okay? I'm not seeing myself.
It's perfect. It's perfect. Okay. And you're still visible as well.
Okay, fantastic. So here is just the first instance that started me on this journey of this gunpowder plotter, Percy, infected, yes, of treason, confected, and even by nature thereunto addicted. Right, so now you all know that confected and addicted rhyme, so you can use that in your own poetic invocations, such as they might be. All right, so from here, then, as I began this journey, I found, so here's a Puritan preacher, John Downham, who had a lot to say about drinking, and he describes it in terms of the word addiction. By excess, they, heavy drinkers, addict themselves to much drinking and make it their usual practice to sit at the wine or strong drink. He talks about those drinkers who addict themselves to this vice, who find it sweet and pleasing. So he's using that language of kind of sin and vice, but combined with addiction. Here's just an image to give you a sense of some of the characterization of drinkers. This is a kind of text that opens, dissects, and anatomizes the drinker, and it has a kind of lurid title page. So I also then found evidence that connected drinking and the brain. So here's a pamphlet called Woe to Drunkards, with its image, and so in there's language about the brain. In a sermon preached at Paul's Cross, there's a notion that wine gives the brain a blow like a subtle wrestler. It may supplant the feet afterwards. Or here in Woe to Drunkards, wine takes away the heart and spoils the brain. So we have at least a sense that alcohol hurts the brain, even if it isn't the sense that the brain actually causes the addiction. I also then found material on drinking and disease, and there's a lot of material on this. I'm just giving a small sample, but drinking causes diseases in the bodies of man, apoplexies, falling sickness, palsies, dropsies, consumption, giddiness of the head, inflammation of the blood and liver, distemper of the brain, deprivation of the sense. So that catalog gets rehearsed in a fair number of places. So here, due to excessive drinking, a great number of diseases in William Fulbeck, a similar list in another pamphlet. So there's a pretty robust sense of drinking, disease, and an effect on the brain. And I think this is what Hanna Pickard called in her webinar a kind of soft model. It's not a model of addiction where the brain disease is causing the symptoms. It's a model where excessive drinking is then causing diseases. But there is definitely a pathological sense of alcohol's effect on the body and of a person's relationship to this substance. And so I did find something that was medicalized. It's not simply moralizing, and nor is it as much of, or some of the research on drinking can be, which I've participated in too. It's not just festive, right? So it's not moralizing, it's not festive, it's something else. It's medical, it's medicalizing anyway. And then I also found something that might be called a kind of explanation for where this addiction comes from. And it's a phrase that's repeated by Thomas Trotter when he talks about the kind of quote unquote discovery of alcoholism. It's a Galenic formula coming out of the classical physician Galen. By a long and desperate custom, drinkers have turned delight and infirmity into necessity, so that without wine, they cannot live. So this idea of custom becomes necessity. Something that is maybe a choice becomes a habit and then becomes a compulsion. That Tim Hickman deals with this in his chapter in the Oxford Handbook of the Global History of Drugs, where it's called, his chapter is called From Habit to Addiction. So that phrase appears again repeatedly. Here's Downham again. By tippling makes himself a slave to his vice, and by long custom brings superfluity into urgent necessity. So again, the idea is that something starts as, and this might be a very familiar process to some of you, something starts as an apparent choice, but as it becomes something more habitual, it then becomes something that is compulsory. All right, so here's a kind of image to meditate on for a moment. This is another, just there are many images of people falling over from drinking, of people here, in this case, kind of mortality rising from over drinking. All right, so given all of the material I found, I thought, I have a great book. I'm going to be making this contribution. I will illuminate the prehistory of addiction as this medical disease, earlier than people might have thought, certainly before the 19th century, before the 18th, even before the 17th, before gin and all the gin acts. I'm going to show that there is this addictive behavior. And I will also be then contributing to, as I say, the research on food and drink in the period. All right, so I'm going to pull out of slides, and this might, because I'm going to now talk just as myself. This might mean when I move back, I'm sorry, there might be a delay again, but I'm going to just speak as myself long enough that it's worth not being in the slides. All right, so I'll just say that here I had it. I had the book. In fact, I had a full draft, but the final product left me very unsatisfied. First of all, I looked at the book and I felt uneasy because it was a bit like the equivalent of daylight savings time. It's like, oh, look, it's an hour earlier, right? Nobody really likes daylight savings time. And I think it might not have been that huge a contribution. And second of all, no matter how hard I tried, the book came across as moralizing. Every time I would give a presentation, it just seemed like I was trying to say, look at this disease, look at these, it just, I didn't like where I was intellectually. Okay, so that was bad enough, but actually even worse, I was having to ignore a lot of evidence that I found because it didn't fit into my idea of what addiction was. I had all these references, and at first I thought they were just outliers, but they were so numerous, it was hard to ignore them. All right, so I was kind of in this stuck position. But as Bruce knows, because he's read the epilogue of my book, something else happened, which was I had a child. So I had to take a pause from the writing of the book. And with a new child, I had been reading for all this time about people who risked their health for something outside of themselves, who risked their livelihood for ingesting a substance or engaging in a behavior. And essentially, that was my circumstance as a new parent. I was told things about bone density loss or glucose levels or hydration. If any of you have gone through the happy process of the medicalization of, pregnancy and parenthood, this may resonate for you. And then when my son was born, there was sleep deprivation, vitamin depletion, total isolation, mixed in with maybe some depression. It's like, what is this? Furthermore, I had people lecturing me all the time about how to live my life, what to do, what to eat. I had people telling me, don't eat an avocado, don't do this. Well, let me tell you, when you're used to being a professional person who's taken seriously, all of this is hugely destabilizing. And all of these things resonated entirely with the symptoms of addiction, endangering one's mental and physical health, being vulnerable to outside lecturers, people who say they know better. Yet at the same time, everybody told me I was doing great. They were so happy for me. They were completely celebrating all of these choices that were endangering my health and well-being, because it looked so wonderful that I had this child that I cared so much about. So when we combine the kind of dissatisfaction with all of the evidence and then my disorientation with my role as a new parent, when I got back to the book, I just thought, okay, I'll just go through my findings again quite systematically and see what happens. And this is the point where I then found the surprise that takes me to part 2 and that brings me to you. All right, so part 2 of my talk, surprises. When I went back to the material, first of all, it was like a little life raft. It was like, here I am at my desk. I'm so happy to be here. But as I was moving through it, I had this itching sense that the archive was trying to tell me something that I was not capable of understanding, that kind of conceptually, intellectually, maybe even ideologically, I just hadn't been able to hear. So as I was going through these references that didn't make sense to me, like legal battles over drunkenness in the state papers, or religious writings on addiction and drunkenness, or the literary appearances of the term addict, I had to kind of listen again, and I had to be more curious and ask, why is addiction appearing in 1530s tracts on God? Why is it appearing in travelers' accounts of journeys to Africa or the New World, in translations of Cicero, in advice books? What was it doing? All right, so my return to the comprehensive survey really revealed that I was too blinkered. I had been too hasty in my dismissal of these like supposed outliers, because in fact, they were the bulk of the material. So what I found in the end was a story that had been right in front of me all along. It was a story about the word addict itself. And for me, that was the kind of click moment when everything came into sharp focus. I felt as though suddenly I recognized this word addict was trying to tell me something. And it was telling me something about agency and devotion, about pledging oneself. So at this point, I will then reshare the some slides that give you a sense of things. All right, so thank you for your for your patience as I do this again. Okay, here we go. So what I'm going to show you in the first slide that will appear as soon as this has loaded up is a slide that gives you the etymology of addiction itself. So addiction is made up of ad, to, dicere, to speak to. So to speak to something, to pledge oneself, to be attached. All right, so resume from slide 10. All right, so here we go. And for those of you who are interested in the etymology of addiction, I just want to direct you to Richard Rosenthal has a piece in the journal that Derek edits that's on the history of the etymology of that word. So it's an interesting piece. All right, so here we go. Oh, okay, so all right, so there, I don't know if you could see this. It's ad, dicere, and then to addict. I had a kind of cool graphic. I don't know if that came across. So the history of this word, addict, actually extends from Roman law, where to be an addict was to be consigned to, because of debt, to someone else, to be kind of taken over by them. Then into the English language in the 1530s, when it begins to appear in real kind of robust concentrations. So here are some of the examples, and almost all of them in the 1530s, when the word addict appears in English, are from religious texts. So George Joy is the first person to really introduce this word and use it repeatedly in the language. And so here are some examples. He talks about God's servant, which is addict unto thy worship. Or he encourages people, be addicted or addict to none but Christ. So one can be addicted to worship, one can be addicted to Christ. George Joy is the first, he's the one who produced the first printed translation of several books of the Old Testament in English. And so in here, he's praising those faithful followers of God and Scripture. Here, as many of you will know, is a homily of good works, and homilies were kind of sermons or advice pieces that were circulated in churches across the country in England. So here's the homily of good works that says, those who did addict themselves to more fervent prayer, it might please God to turn his wrath from them. So addict yourself to prayer and kind of get a little bit of a safety card, as it were. Here's another one. Humphrey Gifford talks about how readers should cast away the vile, vain vanities and addict all their doings toward the attainment of life everlasting. So we have a sense of addiction as a kind of devotion or attachment, dedication. Here is in this imitation of Christ, learn to contemn outward things and addict thyself to spiritual. So there's a valorization of addiction. There's a sense of wonder about it. And these texts encourage a model of addictive living, giving oneself up to something, to a community of the faithful, or at times to a community of scholars, or even to a community of travelers, or to the world itself. Joy and others want their readers to become addicts. Now, that doesn't, so we hear in the imitation of Christ, it's not necessarily easy. Few there be which addict themselves to the study of celestial things, because few can withdraw themselves wholly from the love of this world. It's not very easy to become an addict, to move away from the world with its pleasures into the study of celestial things or godly things. All right, even dictionaries that include the word addict talk about the addiction in terms of this kind of devotion or attachment or connection. So here's in Latin, it means to assign or make over by sale, as I suggested, to hand over, surrender, to enslave, or to devote. So in English dictionaries, we get that same sense coming out of the Latin. An addict is to say, avow, deliver, sell, permit, grant, or appoint to another person. Thomas, to addict is bequeath or give himself to something. All right. So I'm trying to give you a sense of the size of the evidence or the type of evidence that was out there that I began to find. And I then turned to a computer scientist, a wonderful research student who was able to put all of the available things in Text Creation Partnership into a computer program. And it took several days for it to run through everything in order to test positive versus negative invocations of the word addiction, just to make sure that I wasn't now becoming kind of equally interested in the religious and finding that whatever. I wanted to make sure my findings were correct. And in fact, a huge percentage of the use of the word addiction is positive. So I felt sort of more emboldened in my kind of quest and interest. Now, as I suggested with one of the earlier quotes, this doesn't mean that addiction is easy, okay? People might be counseling each other to become addicts. They might, think of addiction as honorable, as a worthy dedication. But as we hear in other sources like John Huarte, if the child have not the disposition and ability which is requisite for that science whereunto he will addict himself, it's a superfluous labor to be instructed therein by good schoolmasters. All right, so you have to work hard, but maybe even something more than that. You have to have the gift of being able to be addicted. All right, and this is a kind of final pulling together of the evidence that I've shown you. One thing that you might have noticed is that for the early moderns, when they use addiction, they tend to have a reflexive construction. I devote myself, I bequeath myself, I addict myself. There's a sense of it being voluntary. That's the reflexive. It's to emphasize the agency of the person who is doing this. There is, though, the involuntary invocation, like under Roman law and largely in the modern period now, that suggests that it's actually the object that's the agent. I'm an addict under Roman law, or I am addicted to heroin. So heroin is the thing that we are addicted to, that is controlling in the sentence, and I'm an addict under the law. The law has told me what I am. So that's what I call the imperative construction. It's dominant again in the classical period and in the modern. So there's this period that I'm studying in which there's a reflexive understanding of addiction. It's something that's chosen. And when we look at the word addict, we have these different layers of like the enslavement that happens in the Roman period with a kind of admirable choice leading into a certain kind of necessity in the early modern, then into the modern period with the ways that we use the term addict or addiction. So these tensions are within the word itself and within the grammar that surrounds this word. So what that means, I think, holding these tensions together, holding even the grammatical uses of the word together, is an awareness of addiction as a kind of paradox. It's a deep attachment that can be associated with disease on the one hand and with devotion on the other. And that sense of addiction as a devotion, which I've kind of spilled out for you in the 16th century, is actually there in other periods too. So in this edited collection that we were talking about right at the very beginning, I edited this a volume. There are a couple of essays that talk about addiction and devotion in the context of, say, 18th century India, as there's the kind of rebellions against British colonial rule moving into the 19th century. And then also a sense of addiction, one of the authors talks about in Ishiguro's Remains of the Day. So a kind of British-Japanese writer talking about devotional addiction and attachment. All right, so this complex of something that kind of is and is not voluntary, that might be initially free and ultimately constraining, is what Hanna had called the kind of puzzle of addiction. It's something that I imagine all of you have worked on. And so this will be something interesting to turn to in the Q&A. And this led me then to a set of questions. Oops, did that work with the... All right, do you see a slide that says questions? Yes, I see Derek nodding. Okay, this led me to questions. This is kind of part 3, questions as I lead to wrapping up. How do we understand the paradoxical relationship of consent and constraint within addiction? How to understand the awkward yoking of two apparently opposed impulses, right? Freedom with constraint. How to understand giving oneself away as admirable, right? So these are some of the questions that that I was wrestling with as I finished the project. And this then, as I say, takes me to my third and final portion of the talk, questions. So as I had been writing that first version, sort of before my sense of its maybe boringness and before also having a child, I really had no idea how to answer these questions. They were completely kind of, I think, ideologically and intellectually elusive to me. They seemed difficult. But now, as I was sitting with these paradoxes, with the material, with a kind of new life in a way, I realized that part of my own struggle, which I think wasn't limited to just me, in understanding these questions was, it was really a kind of philosophical problem, which was endemic to my own situation as a 21st century resident of the Anglo-American world. And I say this because I feel that some of the positive words that I even use to describe addiction, like devotion or attachment or commitment, are in fact in the context of the 21st century. This is the most speculative part of my talk. Okay, so we can come back to this if you all are like, no, I totally disagree. That would be great. But I feel that we live in a moment that is deeply suspicious of certain kinds of attachment. So even words that can be positive notions of belief or attachment have a negative valence in the way I've been describing with addiction. So conviction, I have a conviction. Does that mean I have a criminal record, or does it mean that I have a strong belief? I am committed. Does that mean that I have been committed to an asylum of sorts, or does it mean that I have a strong idea? I'm compelled to do this. Am I compelled to do this by the law that is forcing me to do something in particular, or am I compelled because I have a particularly strong desire? Even I would say a word like debt, Okay, if I told you all I was in debt, you might very reasonably imagine that I have financial obligations that constrain me in some way. But of course, we also use it to say I'm in your debt. And that, you know, it might sound, right, because our use of that word can be so negative, it actually erases the possibility of kindness, you know, of relationality. So, you know, again, to kind of go out on my little diving board or limb, I might say that this is, you know, the 21st century is a period of such an individualist paradigm where freedom and sovereignty and individuality and private property are so celebrated, and compulsion, certain kinds of commitment even, loss of control are condemned or questioned, right? Life should be just a buffet table of fun. Drilling down in things might not be as admirable. Sometimes I wrestle with that a little bit with some of my students, I must confess. So what it means is that there might be a suspicion of really deep forms of attachment when there is a valorization of really excessive self-sovereignty. And that's excessive self-sovereignty comes at the expense of community. So I just want to pull back to say this process, you know, where I'm saying we, and maybe I'll just say, you know, where I am theorizing that we might find ourselves, really does come out, we could argue, of the 17th century Puritan response to the material world. Okay, so in this period that I'm describing, there's all these initially appreciative invocations of addiction, it's devotion, but they move over the course of the 17th century into the 18th century into pathologizing senses of people who are addicted to idolatrous images. They're addicted to the Pope. They're addicted to the wrong kind of religion. So the material world, the, you know, church music, stained glass windows, iconography of any kind, paintings, right? I'm gesturing, but how painting. All of these things are part of a material world that lures us away from Scripture and God. So as the Puritans became more and more aggressively suspicious, or Reformed thinkers, some of my historian friends might encourage me to say, Reformed thinkers rather than pure. But as they became more and more suspicious of the lures of the material world, addiction to anything that has a physical manifestation is more and more suspect. It's more and more pathologized. All right. So this brings me to kind of my final kind of insights, thinking about how do we resuscitate then, or how do we keep together the notion of addiction as possibly something that can have positive as well as negative valences. And that led me then to my own kind of working definition of addiction, which may be idiosyncratic, which is to be deeply related, to be deeply attached. To be an addict is to be deeply related or deeply attached. So this is a kind of thought experiment in which the actual ability to be addicted is to be deeply related or deeply attached. Now, the object of addiction matters, of course, okay? I don't want to take that away, and of course we'll come to this in the Q&A. Right, because some choices of object are incredibly harmful. So certain kinds of drugs, certain behavioral addictions, giving oneself over to parenthood, maybe to study, to work, maybe to exercise, maybe to God. Those could be things that our culture continues to valorize, even if we don't use the word addiction. But of course, addiction to again, certain kinds of behaviors or certain kinds of drugs can be harmful. But I guess what I'm trying to suggest sort of in closing is, if we think about addiction as the process of attachment, where the object is the problem, it might allow us the possibility of not necessarily dismissing individuals, not kind of blaming people, as it were, saying that their brains are diseased. Now, of course, there's the kind of big question of if somebody has this amazing ability to be attached, why is it so hard for people to pivot from one form of attachment to another? Right? That's a real question. And I think all of you are in a better position to answer that. But I'm trying to rethink the capabilities of addicts in ways that are not dismissive. So, and I also, I suppose, want to just, in closing, suggest how powerful it can be to recognize that the human being is enmeshed in relationships and communities from the get-go, right? That's certainly true of us all from infancy, but beyond. So I might say, as John Donne does, no man is an island entire of himself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main, right? We are not at our best when we are excessively self-sovereign, when we are isolated, kind of worker bees who manage ourselves incredibly perfectly, right? Is that the best we can do? No. So this is just to end to say that the early modern models of addiction don't just indicate that substance abuse has a long history, which is where I started, but these models offer to me, and I hope to some of you, a way of rethinking subjectivity itself, a way of thinking about the human as someone who is connected, and all of us as having addictive possibilities within us. So there's something, and I'll end with this quote, profoundly and irreducibly mysterious about the combination of individuality and enmeshedness, integrity and integration that constitutes the human being. So this is a legal theorist who just talks about us as connected, talks about community. So I'll just say what was surprising is that it took the archive to get me here. It's not where I expected to end up. And I'm really grateful to all of you for listening to my thoughts about the early moderns with addiction, devotion, and community. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Rebecca. And I'm delighted to now open the floor to any questions or discussion points. It's a webinar, so please feel free to contribute. Who'd like to kick things off?
I would. I'm not sure how to raise my hand.
Okay, Bruce, you go ahead then. I think Michael is next then. He managed to raise his hand.
Okay. Rebecca, thank you for enlightening us. I just think this is wonderful. And I'm also carried away with how you have used your experience as a new mother to enrich your analysis. But I won't go on and on with this. My question is, it seems as if we in the field of addiction, we who practice with addiction, have narrowed the field down to a negative drug problem. But it seems, looking back to the older usage, that we've expanded it, because we've expanded it to include people who are not really devoted to their drug at all, but people who just use too much and it eventually kills them. For example, smokers. I have had the opportunity to watch people die of emphysema who are not devoted to their tobacco at all. They hate it. They just need it, or for whatever reason they keep smoking. But there's no sense of devotion there, and yet devotion to tobacco is possible. And James M. Barrie wrote a whole book about it called My Lady Nicotine. But so we both narrowed and expanded the sense of addiction. Is that right, or is that not right?
Well, this is where I think it's really useful for all of us to think together, because in a way, okay, let me just say, is it right or not right? I think it's both. I mean, I think what you really put your finger on something, which is there may be a devotional relationship to even substances that where their use is condemned or seen as unhealthy or illogical. The person may not want to be in that relationship at all. Okay, and that is negative. It's, you know, so, and yet then, as you suggest, there are other readings of relationships to tobacco that point to a kind of devotional usage. Or so one way of answering your question is simply to say the notion of addiction as having any kind of devotional capability, as being at all positive, is a story that I had found so surprising and untold that I am really pivoting and emphasizing that. And I want to be really clear, that doesn't mean, particularly for people who are, you know, practitioners, medical expert, like I am in no way suggesting that we just simply imagine this to be devotional. I hope that's clear. So I think it's a both and. But the issue is, how do we integrate some awareness that of this longer history, it really with the goal in my mind of refraining from the kind of finger wagging that I think can even happen, well, that happens with, you know, look at this diseased brain. I mean, that may not be the point of the BDMA, but it might be the impact, as we're always learning. Like, I'm learning this in my DEI work, right? There's the intention and there's the impact. And so the impact is at least for folks I've known, a largely negative one, to be told, well, there's something really wrong with you. All right. I don't know, Bruce, if that answers your question, but I'd like for other people to think with you on that, because again, I'm really honored to be here with you all who have other layers of understanding. You know, mine is historical, literary, philological. All right, so I did see there was another hand, but I think
Michael, would you like to come in now?
All right. Thank you very much for the very stimulating talk, and particularly to your attention to the historical roots of the word, particularly addictus. I have considered in some publications of mine, including the latest one that Derek is familiar with, the dispute between those who were trying to introduce the term addiction as the official designation for substance use disorder, as opposed to dependence. That was a 2006 conversation, on one side of which was the current director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. So both sides established that addiction and dependence are in danger of stigmatization. That's what sort of triggered my attention to this thing. Indeed, the addictus is a slave who is assigned to a creditor, and but my sort of point here was that regardless of what term to use, addiction or dependence, and both sides, of course, were pro disease model of addiction. So regardless of what term is used, dependence or addiction, it's going to become sort of disparaging, so to say, because the condition, like addictus, the slavery here, is considered voluntarily self-imposed. And that's why it's reprehensible. That's why it's considered to be reprehensible. So whatever term is used, it's not going to be so much stigmatizing as it's going to reflect the societal opprobrium that is attendant to this particular behavior. So I wonder what you think about that.
All right, well, thank you for that. And so this issue of what term is used. So for example, in the edited collection so thank you for giving me the reference to your work, which will be really enjoyable to investigate. And then I'll also say on that history of, say, something like the DSM and the recent reclassifications, the Erica Wright and Steve Sussman wrote a piece at the end of this recent edited collection I did for a journal special issue that talks about that precise issue of the move away from the term addiction, the move away from dependence, from compulsion, just the ways that it's weird with Microsoft Teams. I don't know why it kind of moves around a bit from time to time. So I think on the one hand, there is a long struggle with terminology and the relationship between terminology and behavior or diagnosis, and in the context of the kind of American medical establishment, I'll just say, I know Bruce is citing it from Canada, and many of you are from the UK, but in the context of America with its private health insurance nightmare, there is a necessity to have perhaps a language around disease and diagnosis in order to be able to get help for treatment. So it's not, so that's just one point that isn't exactly to your core question, which is really about the movement around terms and the sense of a broader phenomena of this is a behavior that has stigma associated with it. And so whatever the term might be, I heard you to be suggesting there's still going to be this kind of stigma. Mm-hmm. And so I suppose that to me, okay, so I'm telling the history of a term, but that history of a term has ways of thinking embedded in it. And so we're in a kind of a thought moment, right? We're in a kind of ideological framework that tells us certain things about, say, the body and what health looks like and again, 100%, please don't take me to be saying, like in the case of smokers or in the case of people who have suffered from the opioid crisis or from fentanyl, that I'm saying that if we just look at it differently, it will look beneficial or positive. That's not what I'm saying. But I think what I'm trying to uncover is a sense of thinking differently. Like if we suddenly have a term that includes an umbrella that under it is also might include parenthood or work, like Eve Sedgwick is a theorist who talked about the kind of ridiculous proliferation of the term addiction. So people are like, I'm an exercise addict, I'm addicted to chocolate, I'm addicted, right? And so she sort of makes fun of the emptying out of the term by its overuse. Or then you're sort of suggesting maybe an underuse, like a stepping back from the use of the term. But I guess what I'm suggesting is maybe to think to include other possibilities of thinking positively about addiction as a process, independent of the object that it lands on. And partly to think about what does health look like? Okay, so, if addiction looks like one thing, what does health look like? And if health to us looks like a perfectly regulated body that's independent of its community or relationality, is that the best we can do? And so in some ways, and perhaps less satisfyingly, I'll just say, I have questions and I have a desire to open the tent. That's really, that's what I'll say. And I don't have a firm, this is how it should be. I don't know if that's at all satisfying, but that's where I am. So I would be curious what others think, how you navigate it, right? Because for those of you who are working in clinical settings, or for those of you who are coming out of different environments, there may be a sense of the real necessity of understanding addiction as this disease. So I'm just curious to hear from others about how you find, say, working with individuals, or in your own labs or research units with questions of addiction and pathology, I guess. But I'm open for any other questions too, of course.
Who'd like to come in? Michael, would you like to get back? Come back on that response, or Bruce, or can I invite anyone else to? Oh, thank you, Daniel. Do you want to come in? You've got.
Hiya, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the talk, Rebecca. It was very interesting, and thanks to Derek and the network for putting it on. It was just more of an observation and a bit of a question, perhaps. I just thought that whether, I don't know if I'm getting this right, but whether you were talking about the term in the reflective or reflexive or the imperative terms, they both seem to point towards people who are very obsessive about things or have an obsessive mind towards things, whatever the object, whether that be alcohol or religion or faith or whatever. And perhaps now in the modern world and in modern society, we have more of an awareness or a distrust of obsessional thinking, no matter what the object, because we're more focused on balance and, like you mentioned, health. And perhaps we now look at any kind of high focus on one particular thing, or what you might call an obsession, to be potentially unhealthy and not as balanced.
100%, 100%. And I think that was really well put. And, and again, okay, this is I'm making a kind of philosophical intervention here. Like I'm trying to suggest, and so you put it very well, and I'd be curious to hear from the rest of you. Like, look, this is a moment where I have more and more and more students, for good reasons, okay? I'm a parent. I see how hard it is for kids. Like, don't get me, it's not lack of sympathy, but more and more students have pieces of paper that tell me about all of the complex accommodations that they need. And so suddenly something that might be, say, a kind of obsessiveness around paper writing becomes instead a diagnosis, right? And so, like, an obsession that says, I am so interested in this one paper, I can't stop thinking about it, but no, you have to have a balance. You have to do all your schoolwork equally, and you have to do it all sort of equally well at the kind of almost A level, I guess I suppose that there are just different ways of inhabiting the world. And of course, the news tells us, in modern America, not the least, that certain kinds of obsessions are, in fact, downright scary. They're scary and they're violent and they're weird and they lead to horrible things. Okay, so it's like, yes. But what about all of the other, like, obsession too, right? It's like, I think about that and suddenly I'm like thinking about all of the violent possibilities, but that's also Leonardo da Vinci, right? That's also Michelangelo. So anyway, I see that there's another hand, and everybody's box. Oh, it's Nick Heather. Everybody's box is so small. I can see your faces, but I can't see your full name. So
over to you, Nick. You're muted.
Okay, thanks. I've just unmuted myself. Well, look, thank you very much. Rebecca, for that fascinating talk. I mean, so valuable and interesting. I think that there's some commonalities between your view of devotion and the work of Jim Orford, actually. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, are you?
Mm.
Well,
Jim, I'm sorry,
Jim Orford. He wrote a book called Excessive Appetites, which was very influential, and in fact, there's 2 editions of it. And he places great stress on the notion of attachment as being the essence of addiction. So I think you'll find some commonalities there. However, I take a somewhat different view. I mean, obviously, I'm aware that addiction, one of the dominant features of addiction, which can't be ignored, is what you describe as attachment, devotion, and so on. But I think, meanings of words change, obviously, as you demonstrated so interestingly. And I think it's legitimate to ask, what definition of addiction is relevant to our present circumstances and to progress in understanding addiction. And my view, which I've written several times, is that the most useful way to define addiction is in terms of enslavement, in the sense of being attached to something you don't want to be attached to and struggle to break free from. I think that's the problem which confronts us, and the problem which confronts our clients if we're in clinical practice, that they have tried to change their behavior but have been unable to do so and seek help in doing so. And so I think I don't see any use for a term like positive addictions. It seems to me that's merely confusing things. Like somebody who is absolutely devoted to, I don't know, painting or whatever, and spends their whole life totally engrossed in that activity. I don't think it's very helpful to call that person addicted. I mean, I can see that possibly in the 16th century he might have been called addicted, but in our present circumstances, I don't think it's useful. Well, I think that's it.
All right, thank you for that. Yes, okay, so I absolutely right here that you work in a context where in a certain way it's the Roman understanding of addiction as enslavement, as being assigned over to something, whether it's the law or a debtor or to this substance, whatever it is, that is the more meaningful term. Now, I suppose I would just ask back, how do the people you work with, or how do you yourself imagine, what is the enslaving force? Is it the object or the behavior? Is it like what has this power? Is it the brain? Is it the body? Right? Because we know, well, people say go through rehab, they actually no longer have a physical dependency, but nonetheless, right, say social cues, smells, community, then suddenly you're back in the situation. Or with Bruce with smoking, you're right. Like, I'm curious, what would you say is the enslaving force?
We don't know. That is the problem. I mean, I also believe I'm aligned with a disordered choice version of addiction, and I think there's plenty of evidence to show that addictive behavior is voluntary and intentional behavior. So that poses a problem for any simple notion of compulsion. But I think the big problem, and what has bedeviled the field of addiction for so many years, is how to explain behavior that is voluntary and at the same time carried out with an awareness that it's harmful for the person. I think that's what Hanna Pickard refers to as the puzzle of addiction. That's certainly what I refer to as the puzzle of addiction. And I don't think we've answered that question. I think that's for the future. We've been distracted from answering it by the disease model and the brain disease model, which tells people that it's involuntary behavior. But I think there's, as I say, copious evidence that that's not the case. So the answer to your question is, I don't know.
Well, yes. So, I mean, I'm sort of thinking, with you through, on the one hand, addiction as a kind of enslavement, but then on the other, an awareness that actually it's not entirely involuntary, right? So it's not like, as Hanna was talking about, it's not like Alzheimer's, right? It's not a brain disease in the conventional sense that brain diseases might be, where no amount of carrot and stick is going to actually cause the person to set the brain disease model aside. You don't set aside Alzheimer's. So that there is, as you say, with this disordered choice model, a sense of something voluntary. So that then gets me back to the notion of addiction as a devotional choice or some kind of choice, and something that in its terminology has a history of enslavement. So that in a funny way, you began by saying, well, looking at something as devotional is not helpful in a modern context. And yet we're also stuck around exactly that conundrum of something being both a kind of enslavement and emerging out of a kind of choice. And so the word compresses those two opposite impulses, that puzzle. It's in that word. And so, I suppose that another question that I could ask both you, but everybody is, and so I see Bruce's hand here, has to do with, how do people respond to the idea that they are enslaved to a substance or to a behavior? Like, is that helpful? Is it something that allows them a sense of perhaps breathing room or freedom, that, this isn't my fault, this is something that is more powerful than me? Or is that language of enslavement one that is incapacitating, right? I really have no power. I know this is the language of AA, like we're powerless. But one of the things that has been suggested about the success of AA is the substitution of a kind of faith and community, even for people who are not themselves at all religious, but the kind of religious or faith-based framework that is some of that language in AA seems to suggest that for certain addicts anyway, the movement from, say, alcohol to community and a certain kind of faith is very helpful, because there's a simultaneous sense of powerlessness, or maybe I was enslaved to this substance or to this behavior, and a sense that does not totally define me, that I can pivot into. So I have a feeling that we're a little bit more in agreement here than I might have thought at the beginning of your question, because in your follow-up, I thought, actually we're both talking about the same kind of puzzle. Anyway, but I'm going to let Bruce weigh in here.
Bruce, you're muted.
I wish I could shed some light on these very, very difficult questions, but this is where we often become stuck, and I think we're not going to get out of it today. I would, if I may, I would change the topic, and I would ask two questions. One is, how shall we understand the fact that if we Google any kind of product that we like lingerie or art or living room furniture or television documentaries and the word addicted, we find that the word addiction or addictive usually, this word is used as a selling point. People buy things because they are said to be addictive. And I don't know how to understand that exactly. That's one question. But the other question, if I may, is when you started, you gave a list of people who are people in literature of one way or another who are interested in addiction. And it gave me the wonderful feeling that there's a parallel universe of people in addiction who are working on these same issues. And I'd like to know how to get to that universe, because I think, obviously we need all the help we can get over here in our universe. So I'm hoping you might say something about that.
Oh, well, thank you for that. So I guess I'll start with the second. So the folks I mentioned, not to give but I'm plugging this because it is precisely not me. I edited this, but I know, Bruce, you ordered a copy already, which is really kind, but it's really the voices of other people who work in this kind of broad field in the humanities. And most of the folks that I cited are historians. So Phil Withington, Josie Cree, who was Phil's student, then like Roy Porter, Sarah Warner, Jessica Warner. These are folks who have worked largely in history departments. And on the literary side, there is there's a scholarship certainly of people who look at addiction in literature as a kind of phenomena. So looking at somebody like Tennessee Williams, or looking at Eugene O'Neill and Long Day's Journey into Night, or Hemingway. So there you can find, so there are conversations about kind of addicted characters or addicted authors. There was a lot around The Million Little Pieces, the guy who sort of had this really tell-all autobiography about his really kind of horrible journey, and then it turned out that it was fictional, and so people were really upset, which I thought was quite interesting because, it's like, so you're upset because these horrible things didn't actually happen to him. You really want get that he was lying, but nonetheless, it's sort of a little peculiar to be saying, I really wanted to know that these things actually happened to you. So there's that kind of level of conversation. Then there are historians who look at the earlier history of consumption practices. But in terms of people who actually are working on a history of addiction itself, there are not really very many of us, I must say. But it is growing, and I think, right, Tim Hickman was working, but the historians have really been wrestling a bit. But in this volume, you'll see there are folks who are talking about India or early Taiwan, or and then as you know, the Rudy, who works on Iran. Anyway, so that's not. I have to say there is a world, but it's if I'm given an invitation to a great conference that's lit folks, I will invite you. So you will learn.
Can I just use this opportunity to plug our next speaker, who's going to be, I think, as Rebecca already mentioned, Carl Eric Fisher. So we're going to get another historical perspective for our next webinar. But Rebecca, do you want to maybe answer the first question Bruce posed about positive?
Carl wrote a terrific book that is a Penguin history of addiction, and I must say he was very systematic about contacting kind of anybody I knew in the field of historical studies of addiction, like a colleague of mine, Peter Moncall, has a book on, it's called Deadly Medicine, and it's about the early colonial period in America, where he talks about alcohol. Again, the language of addiction isn't always in these studies, but his will be a good place to go for a kind of comprehensive like bibliography, because he really was pretty systematic about reaching out to people who worked on drugs and alcohol. And okay, so the first part about addictive purchases. Okay, this is a real chestnut, isn't it? I mean, it kind of is combining a number of the idea that you're kind of most at yourself when you're able to consume what, you know, the kind of high level capitalism that's behind luring people in with this language of like playful addiction, right? I mean, this is sort of everything that I think can be quite noxious, like meshed into one little activity. And so, right, it's the kind of taking something that is quite serious and making it into a kind of playful tease, like, oh, it's addiction, but don't worry, you're gonna be able to control that handbag, that, you know, or what, I don't know what you're seeing it with. I imagine it's not handbag purchases. Maybe it's like an addictive sauna day or life at a spa. Bruce, what are they actually? Or addictive, like foie gras? Like what is it that's the...
My favorite British situation comedy, Doc Martin, is advertised as totally addictive. And it made, when I read it, it made me think actually of you and of your description of having a new baby as having some elements of addiction in it. And in the best sort, you know, in the best sort of devotion and caring and, you know, complete and selflessness. And it made me think that notion of addiction as being something profoundly positive perhaps lingers in the language, kind of behind the word in a way, you know.
Yeah.
Despite the way that we who take ourselves to be experts use the word, it may be that the more profound meaning lingers still.
Right. Okay. I see what you mean. Okay. So that it's not actually, I was imagining a shopping mall with like addictive products, but you're talking, in fact, I love Doc Martin too. And the truth is it is a little bit addictive because it's a different world, right? It's a world that you can immerse yourself in, and it's, you know, I love that village. And so,
yeah.
And so I mean, that's an interesting point, because that, I would say, is a little bit of a razor's edge. I don't know how all of you feel about, like, I love TV shows that have a beginning, middle, and end. Okay, so I think that Doc Martin is, to me, you know, that's addictive in the sense of a world, a community. You kind of make friends with people in the show, and so I suppose that is a positive use. It's also, though, you know, my own sense of certain other kinds of like screen entertainment that have addictive possibilities, like, I know because now my kid is 9, right? So he has I had to actually start a Dungeons and Dragons at-home workshop in order to try to keep him from all of the screens that all of his compatriots are kind of, you know, it's like YouTube all the time. It's Minecraft. And these things, I will say, because of course I wanted to try them out and see, I don't want to just come to some conclusion, like they are addictive, right? When you have a 10-second spot and then it's like renewing and renewing and renewing and renewing, and your brain is constantly having a sense there's no end, right? It's not an Aristotelian plot where there's a beginning, middle, and end. It's just a constant promise of something that might happen at some point. And so I suppose that when it does come to the possibility of addiction, like, this isn't the world's most satisfying answer. So first of all, I'll just say thank you for saying that there's some relationship between what I'm arguing and Doc Martin and that appealing world. But I guess that I'll also say that precisely what allows a TV show to say it's addictive is that, in fact, there are many screen activities that are really addictive in ways that are very difficult. And so I know, Bruce, you were trying to ask a question that got us away from the conundrum of like entrapment and kind of devotional choice. And I feel like I've kind of taken us right back there by panning out. But I do, yes. So I suppose, yes, thank you. I do think more than we might realize now that we've talked about this, I sort of invite you all to hear in popular culture, as you have suggested, Bruce, the invocations of addiction as something that might be a kind of intellectual, aesthetic choice. But it really isn't to take away from the fact that even those positive invocations today might be piggybacking on the sense of like enslaved release into something that we can't get out of.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think we have a question from Emily. Wonderful.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. I really enjoyed this talk. It's not something I've kind of considered in this way before. And the conversation right now around TV shows made me think of the terminology we use when we talk about watching them in succession, like binge-worthy, which is saying that something, we should really actually be engaging in very consumptive behavior. And I just was curious about your thoughts around the use of that terminology in particular and what it kind of means for how we think about addiction.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. And let's see, I'm aware this is our last 5 minutes, so I'm going to, I know, what do I think? I mean, right, because on the one hand, binge-worthy suggests that pleasure of consuming, like of wanting to be taken into a world. And I guess here's one way of putting it, with something like Doc Martin or with something like Netflix shows where suddenly you're watching Breaking Bad or The Chair. I'm chair of the art history department at the moment. And so I especially liked watching The Chair to see all these antics. I think that if we're using that language of addiction to describe an immersive experience in an environment, in a world that we might not normally have access to or be a part of, but we suddenly for a time become taken over by it. I think what it's really acknowledging is that pleasure of giving oneself away to something. And I think this does take me back to one of my kind of key points, is that even as I fully 100% understand, and I think that that Nick put it well, that the obvious dangers of enslavement to something, or what might seem to feel like enslavement to something, there is nonetheless a desire on the part of many humans, as we know, right, from literally this commercial language that sells things, or this compliment that tells other people to watch it. It's binge-worthy. That idea of being taken over by a community, by temporarily, is something that is pleasurable. So even as we move through life and we're told again and again, control yourself, be moderate, be balanced, be healthy, have kind of sovereignty over yourself, like have your own property limits of like a piece of private property that is both your body and your house. And, that's what we're all supposed to be working toward, is like our little containers. Even as we have all of that kind of shoving us into our own individual like trajectories of success, again and again, the world around us recognizes that being immersed in something is wonderful and it's a big part of life. And so I suppose that with the idea of binge-worthy TV, the real question becomes, to what extent do we get to choose what we immerse ourselves in, what we become overcome by, what our obsession is. And maybe that's one of the wrestling points with addiction, is that many of you are dealing with people who don't feel as though they had a choice in what that obsession or preoccupation, or if we want to say enslavement, is. But when it comes to TV, we get a sense, oh, I chose that, right? And I chose to be overcome by that. And that's a good thing. So it's just to hold on to the idea that it may be a certain kind of human nature that community, immersion, being overcome, that these things are just as desirable as being totally in control all the time. So I don't know if that wraps everything up with a little bow, but maybe the wrapping paper is like, it hasn't been taped down and the bow hasn't been fully tied, but there's a gesture towards some kind of a gift.
Emily seems happy enough, so thank you very much. Any very last minute questions? We have time for one more brief question if anyone wants to come back in.
Oh no, I wrapped it up in a bow.
Well, I'm looking at the time. We started 3 minutes late, so I thought we still have 3 minutes to go. So just want to give the opportunity at least. That doesn't seem to be the case. So let me wrap things up by saying a massive thank you to Rebecca for fascinating and thought-provoking talk, and also thank you to all our contributors. And well, I hope to see you all at the next talk. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.